Welcome to Renewable New York, Local Energy Today and Tomorrow. This welcome is in behalf of the hosting sponsors, Catskill Citizens for Safe Energy, Chefs for the Marcellus, Grassroots Environmental Education, New York Sustainable Business Council, Sierra Club Lower Hudson Group, and Westchester for Change. We're really thrilled to have you all here this evening. We also want to express appreciation for the over 40 co-sponsoring organizations for this event this evening, and as you can see, everyone did a great job in getting the word out about this event. My name is Ellen Weininger. I'm the Educational Outreach Director for Grassroots Environmental Education. Thank you. Thank you. We also take great pleasure in acknowledging several elected officials who are here this evening or who will be here this evening. I can identify one who's in the room right now, Legislator Carol Chalk from Tompkins County. Thank you. And New York State Senator George Latimer is represented this evening by Andrew Ferris. And New York State Assemblyman David Buchwald. Is Danny Weisfeld here? Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. From Assemblyman Buchwald's office. And we're anticipating a couple of Westchester County legislators as well. And Mayor Leo Wegman, is he here yet? From Croton-on-Hudson? Okay, we'll look out for him. And City of White Plains Commissioner of Public Works, Bud Nicoletti. I did not see him, but if anyone spots him, make sure he finds a seat. I'd like to also take the opportunity to express special thanks to a wonderful planning committee who's worked really hard to bring this event to you this evening. Erin Heaton. Erin is from Sierra Club Lower Hudson Group and Catskill Citizens for Safe Energy. Better Broad is out there at the desk. Susan Van Dolson with Westchester for Change. Laura Niederhofer from Chefs for Marcellus, and Ross Karstens. And a special thank you also to Charlie Olson, our videographer, preserving history here, and Michael J., our sound engineer, they've been doing an incredible job. Before we started, I want to make sure that each of you has received a copy of the program. There's a lot of valuable information on that two-sided page that's sitting on your seat. There's incredible resources and contact information and background material, so hold on to that. This evening we are honored to present Dr. Mark Jacobson of Stanford University, Dr. Anthony Ingraffea of Cornell University, and Dr. Jannette Barth of Pepacton Institute, three of the co-authors of the recent groundbreaking study examining the feasibility of converting New York State's all-purpose energy infrastructure to one using wind, water, and sunlight. They will explain the technical capacity and economic feasibility and benefits of a renewable energy infrastructure that can transform New York State by eliminating our dependence on fossil fuels. This would stimulate job growth, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve water and air quality, protect public health, lower healthcare costs, and stabilize energy costs. It's a real game-changing plan that can not only fast-track renewable energy, but also reduce our electric power demand by 37%. Now more than ever, we have a mounting urgency regarding this critically important collective opportunity to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy resources. This has been heightened further by recent news events. Last Friday's report by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported the carbon dioxide monitoring station's daily mean atmospheric concentrations went over 400 parts per million for carbon dioxide. These are the highest levels found on Earth in over 3 million years. The safe level, for those of you who may not be aware of it, although I sense that in this crowd you're very aware, God bless you, that the safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million. Thankfully, the solutions are on the shelf. Tonight's program sets the table for the practical implementation at that local level. The Northern Westchester Energy Action Consortium, NWEAC, which is chaired by Herb Oringo. Please, Herb, raise your hand. You should know who Herb is composed of 16 municipalities, and its counterpart, the Southern Westchester Energy Action Consortium, SWEAC, chaired by Nina Orville. And there are many members here tonight from SWEAC and NWEAC, and I really do hope that you get to know them because they're doing very important work here in Westchester County on many levels. SWEAC is composed of 11 municipalities, and both groups will soon be following up with a forum which will describe its outstanding progress with plans and programs, so look out for those announcements, essentially taking what we'll be hearing tonight, and they have already been the boots on the ground putting together the practical applications, and you'll be amazed and truly impressed with their progress. And now I'd like to turn over the podium to Erin Heaton of Catskill Citizens for Safe Energy, and she will introduce Paul Gallay, President of Hudson Riverkeeper, tonight's moderator, who we are also very honored to have here this evening. Thank you.
I don't believe Ellen Weininger expressed enough how much she worked on this event. She did a lot of thanking, but thank you, Ellen. We have this many co-sponsors because of Ellen's outreach, so thank you very much. I'm pleased to present Paul Gallay as our moderator this evening, and he'll be leading you through the evening. I'm just going to read the biography. Paul Gallay is an attorney, educator, and nonprofit executive working to protect community character and improve environmental sustainability. After a brief stint in private law practice, Paul served for 12 years in the New York State Attorney General's Environmental Protection Bureau and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, helping to close the Fresh Kills landfill, raise standards at New York City wastewater treatment plants, and bring hundreds of corporate and government polluters to justice. Thank you. After leaving public service, Paul spent over a decade as an executive in the land conservation movement in New York and Maine, protecting thousands of acres of sensitive land, expanding the constituency for land conservation, and promoting sustainable development practices. Now, as president of Riverkeeper, Paul fights for a cleaner Hudson and safer drinking water for over 9 million New Yorkers. Paul received degrees from Williams College and the Columbia Law School. He was a visiting professor of environmental studies at Williams from 2004 to 2007. He lives in Pound Ridge, and the contact information is on the program. All of this, there's contact for the speakers, so we hope you'll follow up. Thank you very much.
I left out my most important qualification, and that's I'm a Byram Hills High School graduate. Good evening, everyone. I wish you could see yourselves as I can see you. The room is jammed. I imagine that we're on the cusp of violating the fire laws, but the turnout is incredible, and I hope this is going to be made available somehow to folks on the web, because this is a super important evening, and I'm very grateful you turned out, and I'm very honored Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Erin. Thank you all who worked on this program for inviting me to moderate. A couple of housekeeping matters. Questions are going to be done via index cards. And the index cards are going to be handed out. And then they'll be handed back in, I think, to Erin, and then they'll be given to me. And I'll ask the questions. So, you know, phrase them tight, and we'll ask them. We'll get a lot of questions in. We have a good 30 to 40 minutes for questions this evening, which is very exciting. And we still will be able to hear from each panelist for approximately 25 minutes. So we're going to take a deep dive into the ultimate issue facing us all. You know, Riverkeeper is deeply involved in the fracking battle. We're deeply involved in the battle to keep Indian Point from being relicensed. I'm not going to give you the stump speech about Indian Point or fracking, because that's not what we're here to do. We're here to listen to the experts tell us how to move to power driven by wind, water, and sunlight. But we must get away from these sources of energy that are being discussed, and we have an opportunity. The governor has declared a pause. He's hit the reset button on the fracking issue, pending further health studies, and we hope other studies on environmental and social and economic impacts as well. The Indian Point nuclear station is up for relicensing, but there's strong evidence that the state will deny a crucial Clean Water Act permit that would prevent Indian Point from being relicensed. Riverkeeper has initiated its own studies through the Synapse Energy and Economics company of replacement energy alternatives for fracking in Indian Point. And now we have the ultimate study from doctors Jacobson, Ingraffea, Barth, and others, which is going to be presented this evening. Now, I think it was Ellen mentioned the recent information about the 400 parts per million level that has been reached down in Hawaii. And there are some interesting quotes in the New York Times article from last Friday. I'm going to read a couple of them, just in case you needed any sense of the urgency of the situation, but also the sense of the opportunity. Now, the urgency is obvious in quotes such as Peter Tams, who runs the monitoring program at National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at NOAA. It symbolizes so far, this 400 parts per million figure, that we have failed miserably in tackling this problem. That's very hard to hear, but it's very true. Then there's Ralph Keeling, whose father, of course, came up with the Keeling curve. He's at Scripps. It means we're quickly losing the possibility of keeping the climate below what people thought were possibly tolerable thresholds. More very serious words, very troubling, frightening words even. Mark Pagani, Yale geochemist, I feel like the time to do something was yesterday. Again, should we just go hide under the chairs at this point? No, we cannot. Because at this point, whatever impacts are baked in are not the only impacts we could suffer. If we do not turn the ship around, it's going to get worse. So we have an opportunity to keep things from being any worse than they already are from these very disturbing quotes. And I'm not pulling punches here. There's no reason we should pull punches at this point. This is serious stuff. But the final quote I'm going to read is the one that talks about the opportunity. And it is from Richard Alley, a climate scientist at Pennsylvania State University. If you start turning the Titanic long before you hit the iceberg, you can go clear without even spilling a drink of a passenger on the deck. If you wait until you're really close, spilling a lot of drinks is the best you can hope for. So here's our opportunity. This is, I don't mean to trivialize it. This is our opportunity to start moving away from the iceberg. And it's a plan that is inherently implementable. Some of you may have seen Andy Revkin's column about a month ago where he calls it a sort of a thought exercise. Well, I suppose you could have said that fighting fascism in the 1930s was also a thought exercise. Or going to the moon in the 1960s was a thought exercise. This is beyond that. This is an imperative. Some people put it in moral terms. Some people put it in legal terms. I prefer to talk about it as an existential imperative. So that's how we find ourselves in this room. That's why this room is filled to capacity. And that's why this is an opportunity to start turning the ship around, to stop failing and start succeeding. So we're glad you're here. I'm going to introduce our first speaker in just a moment. But remember, this is the community I grew up in. This is the community my daughter's coming back to when she finishes her first year of college in about 3 days. I want her daughter or her daughter's son or 4 generations from now to have a livable, beautiful Hudson Valley. And you're all going to do a lot to help with that, because once you hear what you're going to hear this evening, you're going to be filled with a sense of purpose, a sense of opportunity, and you're going to minimize that risk. So our first speaker, Dr. Anthony R. Ingraffea. Dr. Ingraffea is the Dwight C. Baum Professor of Engineering and Vice Presidential Teaching Fellow at Cornell University, where he has been since 1977. Dr. Ingraffea's research concentrates on computer simulation and physical testing of complex fracturing processes. For his research achievements in hydraulic fracturing, he has won many national and international awards. He became a Fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers in 1991 and was named the Dwight C. Baum Professor of Engineering at Cornell in 1992. Time magazine has named him one of its People Who Mattered in 2011. And please join me in giving a good Central Westchester welcome for Dr. Anthony Ingraffea.
Sound check, okay? Yes. Good evening, everybody. And I'd like to thank all the people and entities who organized this session tonight. It's a great honor to be privileged to be among you and to be selected by the organizers to talk to you tonight. You probably guessed by now that I'm the warm-up act for Dr. Barth and Dr. Jacobson. I really am a warm-up in the sense that I'm going to be giving a talk that's first entitled New York State, Why Not Shale Gas? And as Paul just said, we're not here to be anti-frackers tonight. You're here to hear about this study, this plan, this paper that Mark and Jannette and I were privileged to be among the co-authors of, because it's the plan that can and will repower New York State and empower New York Staters. That's you. That's what you want to hear. But to give it context, you have to have comparison. Scientists and engineers like to normalize their variables. You can't say something is big or small or slow or fast or cheap or expensive unless you have something to compare it to. So my job is to remind you that in New York State, we still have a choice. We can still go one more fossil fuel. We can still go shale gas. Or we can do what you're going to hear tonight. Next slide, or next button.
Someone had asked me.
There we go. Thank you for doing that. There's something different, something better from an economic point of view, from an environmental point of view, from a human health point of view, from your energy bill point of view, from your jobs point of view, from your taxes point of view, and from climate change point of view. And you're going to hear all that from Jannette and Mark, but I'm the warm-up act, so let's get started and go to the next slide. And in 25 minutes, there's not much I can talk about in depth about why not shale gas in New York. So I picked 3 topics that relate very strongly to the strengths of our plan as alternatives. Those are that shale gas development is what I call spatially intense. For it to work economically, it has to happen everywhere. And because it's spatially intense, it brings with it an inevitable, highly heavy industrial impact. So I'm going to spend a few minutes and a few slides reminding you of what that looks like where it's currently happening. I'm then going to transition and talk about an inevitability. There's apparent debate in the media about, will gas wells leak into people's water wells? But it's an apparent debate. There are people in this audience tonight who have had their water wells ruined. So I want to cite for you current industry statistics. on how the industry knows how many water wells in upstate New York will be ruined. And the third topic I only have time to briefly touch on. I'll try to convince you that shale gas is not a clean fossil fuel. And once again, all three of these are going to be background and relate very strongly to the positive message that we're here to transmit to you tonight of a much better alternative than any of these. So next slide, please. 2008, 11:59 p.m., I forget what month it was, the last day of the session of the New York State Legislature, unanimous vote. New York State Legislature voted to modify its its oil and gas law to allow spacing units of up to 640 acres that were primed and perfectly written up by a representative of the oil and gas industry for our legislature to prime the pump for New York State to go shale gas. Spacing unit is an area on the surface, roughly a square mile. Notice it's long in one direction, short in another direction, and notice that these two spacing units are all aiming in the north-northwest direction. Next slide. And you can hit that once. And this would be an area, here's your scale, that's roughly 2 miles, so 8 miles by 8 miles of upstate New York. That's what the industry wants to do to us. They want to concatenate spacing units such that on every square mile there'll be a pad. That's the red dot. And every one of those pads will have 8, 10, 12, 16, 20 wells. And so in every square mile there'll be that many wells, and that's what I call spatially intense. You look in any direction, in less than a mile in any direction, you'll see a pad. It's hard for people from New York State to visualize that because it doesn't happen here. We've never had that kind of gas development in New York State. You can go down to Pennsylvania and you won't see much of that. Next slide. Keep clicking. That's just to indicate the multiple wells coming from each pad. And you have to imagine that would happen in every one of those spacing units. But you go down to Pennsylvania right now. Pennsylvania's been actively developing shale gas for about 5 years, going on 6 years. There have been about 7,000 Marcellus wells drilled in Pennsylvania. About half of them have been fracked and are in production. So it's a very, very young play. In case you don't know it, the industry intends over 100,000 wells in the Marcellus alone in Pennsylvania. So they're just getting started. But this is an indication of what the industry has in mind in terms of spatially intense, heavy industrial activity. This is one county of Pennsylvania. It's Tioga County. Here's the New York-Pennsylvania border. This is a map put together by Shell, one of the 65 active gas operators in the Marcellus in Pennsylvania. And this is a map that indicates all of their lease holdings already arranged into what we would call spacing units. Notice they're all sort of rectangular. They've all got little dots in them to indicate where the pad's going to be located, and they're all oriented more or less north-northwest, south-southeast. You can hit one more time. I'll blow that up for you so you can see it better. This is one company's. Remember, there are 65 operators trying to develop shale gas in Pennsylvania right now. That's one company taking over a county. That's spatially intense development. So the next time you see an article in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal about how one well is going down and going out, and there'll be 6 layers of steel and 6 layers of cement, and that one well can't possibly harm you, think of 100,000 wells. Next slide. So now I want to talk to you about what's happening in Pennsylvania so that you can actually visualize by photographs what I mean by heavy industrial activity on the surface. It's not just a well. It's not just a pad. It's not just one waste pond. It's not just one compressor station. It's not just one processing unit. It's not just one more mile of gathering line or one more mile of distribution line. So I'm going to take you through a couple of pictures so you multiply those ones. So here's a typical 5-well so far pad. Notice it's not your 1-acre grandfather's well in upstate New York. So far, 5 wells on that pad and 1, 2, 3, 4 waste pits. Next slide. I'm going to ask you a question. How many trees were destroyed to build that pad? 10? 100? 1,000? Talking about carbon footprint? That's burning your carbon candle at both ends. All right, again, this is a 5-well pad so far, but again, that's about a 20-acre pad and thousands of trees taken down, not replanted. Next slide. I'm going to walk you through some of the other, what I call ancillary infrastructure. In addition to pads, here's a pad with 7 wells, impoundment dams, condensate tanks, storage units for chemical processing. Next slide. And here you're seeing more. Let's see, private home, bunch of other private homes, pad, wastewater pit, compressor station, processing unit, and of course you can't see the pipelines underground. Now remember the slide I showed you with all those yellow rectangles, and every rectangle had a red dot in the middle of it? That's what you see around every red dot. You won't see it in Pennsylvania right now because they just got started. Next slide. And how would you like to have bought your dream homes out in the countryside of Pennsylvania and then find out you wake up one morning and 300 feet from your back door is a super mister that's trying to evaporate frac flowback in your backyard? Setback distances are not just from pads to homes. Setback distances include wastewater pits from schools and silica sand unloading docks from daycare centers. A lot of setback distances that weren't considered by our SGEIS yet. Next slide. The industry keeps evolving. What I refer to as heavy industrial activity was heavy in 2007. It's heavier in 2013 because the industry continues to evolve, and it's always shareholder objective of getting more gas out of the ground for fewest dollars down. And right now the industry is doing it the dumb way, the cowboy way. I know, I worked with these guys for 25 years. When you do something new in the oil and gas industry, you have 2 choices. You can think it through, do the science first, or if you're in a hurry to make money, you do it the cowboy way. Poke a hole in the ground, see what works. And so what they found out is bigger is better. It's Texas and Pennsylvania. So this used to be the typical compressor station, designed and built in 2010. Next. That's the latest rendition of a compressor station in Pennsylvania. Tens of thousands of horsepower in every one of those units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 compressor units, each of which has tens of thousands of horsepower. Okay. Makes noise and pollutes. So things are getting bigger. The wells are getting longer. The pads are having more wells. There's more frac fluid going into each well on each pad. There's more frac flowback. There's more waste. There are more pipelines, larger compressor stations, more extensive processing units. The industry continues to evolve into even a bigger industrial footprint. Next slide. Enough said. Next one. Okay, moving along. Next topic. Many gas wells will leak into water wells, surface waters, and the atmosphere. How do I know that? The industry told me. The industry told you. The answer is hiding in plain sight. All you got to do is read the papers that the industry writes. Next slide. That's what a leaking well looks like for those of you who have never seen a video of a leaking well. This is the production casing, the steel pipe that goes all the way down into the Marcellus and is supposed to be transporting to the surface methane, natural gas. Except that this well is leaking. It's bubbling in the cellar. It has sustained annular pressure. That methane is coming from thousands of feet underground, and it's getting into the atmosphere, and along the way it's transiting an underground supply of drinking water. So it's no surprise that many families in Pennsylvania have lost access to clean drinking water from their own water wells because of contamination from leaking gas wells. Next slide. How often does that happen? No time tonight to go into all the literature. I can point it out to you. Email me and I'll show you the industry literature. They know how often that happens. They know why it happens. They can just about predict when it will happen. But the most recent data that we've gathered at Cornell from Pennsylvania in the Marcellus, so these are the same 65 to 70 operators who 5 years ago wanted to come into New York, and if it weren't for the wisdom of New York and New Yorkers, would be doing what I'm showing you in New York today. These are the same operators using the best available technology, best cement, best casing, and here's their performance. In 2010, 6% of the brand new wells failed immediately. sometimes even before they're fracked. In 2011, that rate of failure went up to 7%. In 2012, it went up to 9%. I remind you that those are new wells, high technology, state-of-the-art shale gas wells, built in a state that has the toughest regulations in the country. Toughest regulations that we know about are the 10 Commandments. And we all know they never get violated. Okay, so that data, I'll just remind you, is, I'm telling you, it's consistent with previous data from the industry. The industry knows that that's about what's going to happen with new wells, and they also know that as wells age, more of them will fail, so more wells will continue to contaminate either underground sources of drinking water and or the atmosphere. Next slide. And now I remind you that engineers like to normalize things, so a percentage means nothing. You know, if somebody says you got a 10% discount, doesn't mean anything until you find out what the price was to begin with, right? So if there are going to be 50 to 100,000 wells in the Marcellus and the Utica in New York, and if 9% of them are going to fail immediately, how many of them are going to fail? You do the math. Next slide. And it's not only new wells that fail, and it's not only that companies take good care and maintain their wells. I'm going to show you a few slides of what happens when companies come and go, because they do. Once a well has exhausted its productivity, it's useless to the operator. And unless there is rigorous enforcement to keep that well maintained by its owner, it goes into a decay state. So there's an old well in Pennsylvania, and it's leaking gas and petroleum. Next slide. Here's another one, leaking gas and petroleum. Next slide. Here's one that's bubbling up from its production casing that was not plugged. How many of these are in New York State right now? And we haven't even started shale gas yet. How many leaking, abandoned, unknown, unplugged oil and gas wells exist in New York State right now before we even start on shale gas? The answer should be because by law, by regulation, DEC prohibits this. Next slide. Here's the data, and here's the paper you can read it in. By the way, I don't show you junk science. I show you either information directly from the industry, supplied by the industry, or referee journal publications. In 2009, the total number of abandoned wells in New York State was 64,000. 25% of them are plugged. Of those 64,000 abandoned wells, how many have locations that are known? Half of them. So there are over 30,000 wells in New York State, oil and gas wells that have been drilled in the last century and a half. DEC does not know where they are. They haven't been plugged, and they might be leaking, just like those photographs I showed you from Pennsylvania. The point I'm making here is, it's one thing to say a brand new well, chances are 1 in 10 it's going to leak. What you want to know is after it becomes useless, when it becomes useless to a gas operator and isn't productive anymore, it's still a hole in the ground that can transmit bad stuff from under there to up here. And somebody is responsible for that hole in the ground forever. Who's that going to be? Taxpayer or operator? Next slide. Let me move on to my last topic. Again, all three topics relate very closely to what you're going to hear from Jannette, Dr. Barth, and Dr. Jacobson. And these are things that we were taking into account when we developed our plan for repowering New York so as to avoid these sorts of problems and others. Clearly, one of them is climate change. Shale gas is not a clean fossil fuel. Next slide. You've already heard from two speakers before me tonight about the New York Times article, front page, upper right corner. If you want to get attention in the New York Times, you better have an article, front page, upper right corner. It's the first thing the eye is attracted to. 400 parts per million. Here's the data from NOAA over the last 4 years. And as of February of 2013, we were at about 397. And as of last Friday, we had gotten to 400 in one day. And by the end of this year, it'll probably be the yearly average. So this black line is the yearly average. So it was going up about 2 parts per million, concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's now going up more rapidly than 2 parts per million per year. That's a well-known story. It was on the front page of the New York Times. Next slide. Again, there it is. There's the article on the front page. Next slide. That's just a quote that I took out of it, like the quotes that you heard Paul just read. Next. But there's more to the story that the New York Times didn't tell. You all know what it is. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but it's not the only important one. Methane is also a greenhouse gas. Natural gas is methane. Natural gas is a greenhouse gas. And it's more important in the short term than carbon dioxide. That article on the front page of the New York Times and the quotes that Paul read should be alarming. We don't have 100 years to address the problem. What can we do to address the problem in the short term? I'll try to explain it to you. Methane is the second of the 3 bad things that happen from natural gas. One is when you burn it, you get CO2. It's still a fossil fuel. You burn it, you get carbon dioxide. But producing it, drilling for it, fracking for it, unloading the wells, processing it, transmitting it, storing it, and distributing it, methane leaks. No distribution, fracking system, drilling system is leak-proof. So once again, it comes down to what does technology tell us about the numbers? How much is leaking? That's the second bad thing, and I'll expand on that for a few minutes here. Third bad thing is that when you burn methane, as is being done right now in flaring, burning off excess methane during the frac flowback period, or burning off methane that you don't even want to take to market, like in some of the shale oil plays where they're after the oil and the methane is a waste product. When you burn it in a flare, that's inefficient burning. You're burning not only methane, but propane, butane, and you get soot, black carbon. The 3 worst things for climate change are carbon dioxide, methane, and black carbon, and you get all 3 of them from natural gas production. Next slide. Here's the other image that they should have had in the front page of the New York Times. This isn't carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, it's methane concentration in the atmosphere. And as you can see, it also is rising. Next slide. So what? Why is methane important? It's important as a greenhouse gas because it's more potent as a greenhouse gas. 1 kilogram of methane, 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide, which has the higher global warming potential? Methane, by far. Well, what's far? How much? Well, if you're willing to wait 100 years, it's about 33 times more potent, methane, than carbon dioxide. We don't have 100 years to wait. We're already at 400 parts per million carbon dioxide and 2 parts per million methane. So what if you're only willing to wait 20 years? Well, it's 105 times more potent. It would take 105 kilograms of carbon dioxide to have the same effect on climate as 1 kilogram of methane. That means that over the lifetime of a gas well, a shale gas well, if only 1% of the gas that comes out of that well leaks and does not get burned, it's the same thing as if you burned it twice. The advantage to methane over coal, for example, for electricity generation or for transportation as a replacement for petroleum, disappears. Next slide. We tried to show the public, we tried to show regulators, and we tried to show legislators what I just told you in a paper that appeared in a prestigious journal a couple years ago, written by us at Cornell. And this is a graph that compares the impact on climate. That's this vertical axis. Don't worry about the units. This is impact on climate. Higher is bad, lower is good. And we compared shale gas, conventional gas, coal, and diesel oil for their effects on climate due to carbon dioxide, that's the black, when you burn it, carbon dioxide from the production process, that's the blue, and methane. Production of all fossil fuels emits methane, whether you're mining coal or drilling for oil or producing shale gas or non-shale gas, you're emitting methane into the atmosphere. Click one more time. And what we showed in that paper is that our best estimate had a range, upper bound, lower bound. 2011, no one had ever even started to measure a very important piece of data. How much methane is leaking? Nobody knows. Even today, nobody knows. But at least over the last 2 years, we started making measurements. And as you've been reading in some of the papers, some of the newspapers, the measurements that are coming in up here, not down here. So we were, what good scientists and engineers do when they have incomplete data, they give bounds. The answer is probably somewhere between here and here. Unfortunately, the measurements that are being made right now seem to indicate that we were kind of conservative. And that's bad news. Next slide. Again and again. Black carbon, soot. This is a processing unit down in southwestern Pennsylvania. It's where methane is separated from propane, butane, ethane. It's a mini refinery. And if you have wet gas, you got to separate those out. And you burn off. There's the flare. Runs 24/7, 365. Notice the time and the date. Next slide. Just to prove to you, this is about a week later. Burns all day, burns all night. The flare is bright, the flare is noisy, and it's emitting carbon dioxide because it's burning hydrocarbons, and it's emitting black carbon, soot. Next slide. Last slide. Most telling. This is our climate fortune. Again, this should have been on the front page of the New York Times if they were going to do a complete story. Temperature change in the Earth's atmosphere relative to a baseline. Here's 0, 1900. Here we are in 2013. This is measured data. The squiggly line is the result of measurements made around the world by tens of thousands of thermometers. And as everybody knows, by about 2010, we were about 0.8 of a degree centigrade warmer than we were at the beginning of the 20th century. And these 4 curves are computer simulation predictions of our climate future based on an increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, an increasing concentration of methane in the atmosphere, and an increasing concentration of black carbon in the atmosphere. These are our fortunes. Which one do you want to believe? This one, called reference, is business as usual. All the above. Business as usual, all the above. Keep burning everything you can, drill as many holes as fast as you can, produce as much coal, natural gas, and oil around the world, and burn, baby, burn. The computer models say that we get into the 2 degrees centigrade, which is when the climate will be in very, very bad shape. That happens not 100 years from now, but 2042. Plus or minus. These are the error bars on the computer models. So maybe it might not be until 2070, but it could be 15 years from now. Or we could have been smart, and we're still smart in New York, as you're going to hear tonight, later. We can take control of the matter, and we can immediately, or as quickly as possible, drastically reduce the burning and the production of all fossil fuels. And that would put us on this curve. And it says we never get to 2 degrees. We get into over 1.5 probably, but we never get to 2. And most importantly here, the blue curve says if we just control methane and black carbon by not producing methane from shale gas in New York State would be contributing to making this curve the reality. And we'd be delaying getting into the red zone by about 2 decades. And hopefully that would give our kids and grandkids some more time as brilliant scientists to figure out how to reverse all this. I know I'm going through this very quickly, but that's the best that we have right now that the scientists can tell us about our climate future. Next slide. Okay, here's the transition. This is where I'm going to hand off to Dr. Barth and Dr. Jacobson. And we say no to high volume hydraulic fracturing and yes to a much better plan. We, the people, own the sun. We, the people, own the wind. And we, the people, own water. Fuel costs for those energy sources is 0. We take control. As I said, we're going to empower citizens of New York by taking control of their energy future away from the people who own the fuel and putting into the hands of the people who own the fuel. Hope you got that. But now you're going to start hearing big numbers. Jannette and Mark are going to be talking about the very large number of onshore and offshore wind generators, concentrated solar, PV plants, rooftop PV, government rooftop PV, geothermal, wave, tidal, hydroelectric, all these renewable forms of energy. And you're going to look at those numbers and say, are you kidding? In New York State, we're going to do all that in the next 20 years? 30 years? Hardly. Or as our friend Andy Revkin says, what did he call it? A thought experiment. Ready? Remember, my job here was to warm up and give you a contrast between the two choices that we have as New Yorkers. We can choose to do this, or we can choose to do that. 50,000 to 100,000 Marcellus and Utica wells, 8,000 to 16,000 pads. Ooh. Oh, we can choose to do that. Speaking of power, are we running out of power? You need to restart your computer? Anyway, the point I'm making here is, why wasn't this a thought experiment? You don't need the slide, I'll talk about it. When the gas companies went to Albany in 2007 and went to the landowners in upstate New York and got a bunch of landowners together and said, lease, baby, lease, drill, baby, drill, why didn't anybody say, are you kidding? 100,000 wells in New York? 10,000 pads? 50,000 miles of pipeline? 100 processing units? That sounds like a thought experiment to me. Nobody blinked. It's business as usual. They did it in Texas, doing it in Pennsylvania. Why not New York? But as soon as we come up with an alternative, and as you're going to see and hear, it's an alternative that doesn't have all these other downsides, why is it a thought experiment? If we can build all that fossil fuel infrastructure, we can certainly build non-fossil fuel infrastructure, and everybody's the benefit for it. Enough. I went over. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
I have a feeling if I read Dr. Barth's introduction slowly, we're good. Okay, then I'll just read it at normal speed. And it's wonderful because the segue is set up. They're making it easy for the moderator this evening, which I am very grateful about. Dr. Jannette M. Barth is an economist with Pepacton Institute, LLC, a research and consulting organization. Since 1974, Dr. Barth has been estimating regional and local economic impacts in the United States and the United Kingdom. Dr. Barth was retained to estimate economic impacts of the 9/11 terrorist attack. She is formerly chief economist of the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority and consultant for Chase Econometrics and Interactive Data Corporation. Dr. Barth has lectured, written, and testified extensively on the economic impacts of shale gas development. She authored a recent peer-reviewed article on this subject in the journal New Solutions. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jannette Barth.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? Yes. Great. Thank you, organizers, for including me on tonight's program. We need jobs. There's no doubt about it. We need lots of jobs, and we need them right here in New York State. The oil and gas industry wants us all to believe that fossil fuels, and especially shale gas development, will bring many jobs to New York State and will be a panacea for all of our economic woes. They are wrong. Despite industry rhetoric that is frequently repeated by the media, shale gas development will not be good for New York's economy. It will not create a lot of good jobs for New Yorkers, and it will devastate the economy in other ways. I have spent years now investigating the economic impact of shale gas development on the state. I'm going to spare you the years, and I'm just going to go over that part of it in a few minutes before I get to a better alternative. So let's, slide 2, please. Let's start with jobs. An early industry-funded study that was often quoted claimed that 88,000 jobs would be created in Pennsylvania in 2010 due to shale gas development. The reality is that only 65,000 jobs were created statewide in all industries in Pennsylvania in 2010, and half of those were in education and health and in leisure and hospitality. Later, industry claimed that more than 44,000 jobs were created in 2009 in Pennsylvania. This was from an industry-funded study, and the author has been highly criticized as a fracademic. The Keystone Research Center, which is not industry-funded, found that less than 6,000 net new jobs were created in 3 years in Pennsylvania in Marcellus core and ancillary industries. So please be careful to check the sources of the numbers that you hear. The gas industry is very powerful and very rich. They spend a lot of money on political contributions, lobbying, advertising, PR, and even economic impact studies. And then they use the results, the so-called findings from these economic impact studies, in their lobbying and their advertising. Even the DEC's economic assessment was done by a firm that has since been outed as a member of the Gas Industry Lobbying Association in New York State. In West Virginia, Workforce West Virginia shows that the Marcellus and Utica drilling industry has not created much direct employment. In fact, a rather amusing report I saw was titled, "The Emperor Has No Natural Gas Boom." While natural gas production in West Virginia grew by 87%, only 916 jobs were added, and the gas-intensive counties in West Virginia experienced a rise in the unemployment rate from 4.4% to 6.9%, while the rest of the state, without intensive gas drilling, has experienced less job loss. And this is very similar to my own findings, my own research on the impact in New York and Texas from gas drilling. Gas-intensive counties, whether it's fracked counties in Texas or counties with conventional vertical gas drilling in New York State, have higher unemployment rates and poverty levels. And of course, I can't leave out Ohio. In Ohio, several years ago, an industry-funded study claimed that 200,000 jobs would be created in a few years due to shale gas drilling. An independent study, not industry-funded, estimated that there will be only 20,000 jobs created, 1/10 of industry's estimate. Now, there's a new study out of Cleveland State University. It concludes that counties with shale gas production in Ohio have not seen employment growth that can be attributed to shale gas. They have shown that more money is being spent, and that's not surprising given that the gas industry brings in many workers from out of state on a temporary basis. Well, yes, they will spend some of their money there. Much of their income is sent back to their families in their home states who stay there. The money is spent there in those other states, helping the economies of states such as Texas and Oklahoma, but not so much in Ohio. The same would be true of New York State. And by the way, when President Obama makes his claims repeatedly that over 600,000 jobs will be created by shale gas development in the United States, please be aware that this number is from another industry-funded study. I've critiqued that study. It is highly flawed. I find it amusing that after the Cleveland State study showed no gas-related job growth in Ohio, a Cleveland Business Journal reported, the real wave of employment is yet to come. I say, don't hold your breath. A report in the New York Times titled, "Rumors of a Cheap Energy Jobs Boom Remain Just That." I'm going to quote from it. "Manufacturing, for all its renewed promise, is likely to fall far short of the claims by industry groups that millions of new factory jobs are about to be created in the United States because of the unlocking of abundant supplies of domestic energy." They also say, promised job gains from fracking have been slow to materialize. The reality
is that the share of jobs in manufacturing has been declining steadily for decades. Increased innovation and use of technology has reduced the requirement for workers in many manufacturing industries. But still, many supporters of natural gas say, just wait for the infrastructure like pipelines and look at the plans for the new cracker plant in Pennsylvania. They will bring lots of jobs. Next slide, please. I looked at examples of both of these. First, the Keystone XL pipeline. Let's take a look at job claims made by the industry about the Keystone pipeline. The Perryman Group, a consulting firm hired by TransCanada, concluded that 119,000 jobs would be created by the Keystone pipeline. Cornell University's Global Labor Institute found the Perryman Group's study on the pipeline to be flawed, and they found that the employment numbers were highly exaggerated. The Cornell report concluded that employment potential from the Keystone pipeline is little to none. And the famous cracker plant that keeps getting talked about. I'm sure many of you have heard about the ethylene cracker plant that Shell Oil is planning to build in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. A cracker plant separates wet gas and produces ethylene that is in turn used in plastics and other chemical industries. There was a competition between West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, each state hoping that Shell would decide to locate there. There are concerns about the quality of air emissions near a cracker plant, but of course I was interested in the economic impact of the area. So I saw a report that Pennsylvania created a Keystone Opportunity Zone whereby the plant will pay virtually no taxes to the state for 15 years. It was the best offer. It was a better offer than that from Ohio or West Virginia. And so they're going to build in Pennsylvania. Now, I've seen reports that this plant would create 10,000 construction jobs. You all know that construction jobs are very short term. They go away. And then it said it would create another 10,000 permanent jobs. So note that the facility will be built on 300 acres. So I thought, let me look into other ethylene cracker plants owned by Shell. I found one in Norco, Louisiana. The Shell website states that this plant is on 1,000 acres and has only about 600 full-time employees. In other words, the Norco cracker plant is on more than 3 times as much acreage, but has only 6% the number of jobs. It sure sounds like the industry is exaggerating job creation claims once again. We should not be listening to the oil and gas industry. They have been proven wrong far too many times. Sadly, the media, not to mention our president, keeps quoting industry's claims. In addition to the highly exaggerated job creation claims, many significant costs associated with fossil fuels, and especially with shale gas development, are ignored by industry and even by the New York State DEC. Of course, over many years, our economy has benefited tremendously from fossil fuels. But the reality is that many significant costs are hidden and are not reflected in the price we pay for energy or in the costs to the oil and gas industry themselves. There are many hidden costs of climate change, pollution, and health impacts, including mortality and morbidity. In the case of shale gas, there are these very significant costs and more. Next slide, please. Last year, I created this sample. Balance sheet for New York State. What is New York State's net equity from shale gas development? It compares assets and liabilities if shale gas drilling were to come to New York. You can see how much longer the liability list, if I could say that word, is than the list of assets. The negative health impacts appear to be potentially worse than shale gas. In the fracking process, there are many chemicals used that include carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, and there is much waste involved, including flowback fluid, produced water, and drill cuttings, and this waste contains many harmful chemicals in addition to radioactive materials. The impacts of harmful substances being released into the water, air, and land will include high economic costs. Industries that are vital to the economy of upstate New York are likely to be devastated by shale gas development. And after the short-term boom of shale gas drilling comes the long-term bust. It's known for it. Our wonderful tourist spots, our agricultural products, our enjoyment of hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation may be destroyed, to say nothing about the impressive wine and beer-making industries upstate that rely on clear water and land. Peer-reviewed research concludes that areas with extractive industries, including shale gas development, are economically worse off in the long run. I'm going to read just some of the conclusions from peer-reviewed research and research not funded by the gas industry. And these are quotes. Counties that have focused on energy development are underperforming economically compared to peer counties that have little or no energy development. Another one. The areas of the United States having the highest levels of long-term poverty tend to be found in the very places that were once the site of thriving extractive industries. And there is clear evidence that resource-dependent counties in the United States exhibit more anemic economic growth. And counties that were not focused on fossil fuel extraction as an economic development strategy had higher growth rates, more diverse economies, better educated populations, a smaller gap between high and low income households, and more retirement and investment income. And more recent research that looked at the short-term impacts concluded that there were only modest increases in employment and income during the short-term boom, and that the negative economic consequences during the bust exceed the positive economic impact during the boom. So I think you're starting to get the picture on economic impact. Further research has concluded that the values of homes decline if there is even a risk of groundwater contamination. We know that some banks have refused to issue mortgages on property with or near gas wells, and at least one major insurance company will not insure against fracking-related damages. If your buyer cannot get a mortgage or insurance, or if your water is contaminated, how can you sell your home? House prices may plummet, followed by declines in property tax revenue. And banks that issue home mortgages are not the only financial institutions that are worried about shale gas. Some of the world's largest banks have joined an initiative and have just signed off on a major report that describes their concerns about fracking, including well integrity, reduction in disclosure of toxic chemicals, wastewater management, air emissions, occupational exposures, and freshwater use. And how about road costs? You may find it interesting that in Arizona, it looks like the state taxpayers are getting stuck paying for over $400 million worth of damage to state highways. $400 million to the state taxpayers. And that is caused by gas industry activities, and that does not include county or local roads. And it's been reported in Texas that it will cost $2 billion to repair roads destroyed by the fracking industry. Of course, both Texas and Arkansas have a severance tax, and the taxpayers are still getting stuck paying for the road damage. What will happen in New York where we don't have a severance tax? We need energy and we need jobs, but we don't want to destroy our great upstate industries, our landscapes, and clean water that New Yorkers love, enjoy, and rely on. And we don't want to harm public health or our economy. So is there a solution? There is a far better alternative, and you'll hear the details about it in a few minutes from Professor Mark Jacobson, who is the sort of main lead, brilliant mind behind this plan to move New York State completely off of fossil fuels and onto renewables in the form of wind, water, and solar by 2030. Some of us just call it the WWS plan. And this plan would result in positive economic benefits for New York State. With a 100% renewable energy infrastructure, the many downsides and economic costs associated with fossil fuels, and especially shale gas development, would go away. This list of liabilities would pretty much disappear. Next slide, please. Independent research shows that job creation in the production of renewable energy is much greater than in the production of fossil fuels. One group of researchers at Berkeley found that all non-fossil fuel technologies, including renewable energy and energy efficiency, create more jobs per unit energy than coal and natural gas. And research at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst found that for each $1 million of expenditures on producing energy, oil and gas create 3.7 jobs, whereas wind and solar create 9.5 and 9.8 jobs, respectively. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, they have issued 2 annual reports on green energy jobs. The last one came out just this past March. Sadly, federal sequestration has caused them to cancel this report into the future. But the March report stated that in the US, there are about, as of 2011, there were 3.4 million green energy jobs, and they grew at 4 times the rate of all other job categories. With the wind, water, and solar plan for New York, it's estimated that approximately 4.5 million jobs would be created during construction and about 58,000 permanent jobs thereafter. This is for the energy production facilities alone. This is more than the number of far more than the number of jobs that would be lost due to fossil fuels being eliminated. And these estimates don't include the additional jobs that would be created in transmission and with the conversion to electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, with electricity-based appliances for home heating and cooling, or with electricity and hydrogen use for some heating and high-temperature industrial processes. And it doesn't even include estimates for jobs associated with increased energy conservation and retrofitting. The job creation is great. And with the WWS plan, the real estate market and property tax revenues will likely benefit. Rooftop PV and solar thermal technology installations can increase home values. And a recent study in Michigan showed that property values increased only in Michigan counties with wind farms. Of course, it's not clear if that's actually causality or simply a coincidence. But another study that is referenced in the WWS report found that wind farms within 10 miles of residential properties in 9 states found no effect on property values. And the National Association of Realtors more recently issued a summary of about half a dozen research papers on exactly this topic, most of which found that wind farms have no impact on property values at all. So New York must begin moving to the WWS plan right away. Supporters of shale gas development claim that it's needed as a bridge fuel. Don't be fooled by this claim. Natural gas is not a bridge fuel. The Aspen Environmental Group estimated that to convert the entire coal infrastructure to natural gas would cost on the order of $700 billion. I don't think that utilities would be willing to invest this kind of money, and I don't think that financial institutions would be willing to provide financing at this level if natural gas was intended only as a short-term bridge fuel. Next slide, please. There are a number of ways that 100% conversion to WWS will help the New York economy. Jobs in the renewable energy industry are more labor-intensive than in the fossil fuel industries. Again, for every $1 million spent on renewable energy development, there are almost 3 times more jobs created than for every $1 million spent on fossil fuel development. Energy created from wind, water, and sunlight create many jobs for New Yorkers, very unlike shale gas development that imports many of its workers from other states on a temporary basis. The jobs that will be created in New York for New Yorkers under this plan will require a range of skills and education levels. We're lucky in New York State to have many colleges and universities where innovation and research take place. More of that can be channeled toward renewables. We also have many bright people with entrepreneurial skills. We have many experienced workers who can work with their hands. There will be jobs created in urban and rural areas. There will be jobs for engineers and scientists. There will be jobs for contractors, builders, and general home repair workers for installation work, and jobs for many others in retrofitting homes and buildings for energy conservation. And these jobs will have indirect and induced multiplier impacts, creating jobs in other industries that provide supplies and services to these workers and also to the renewable energy industry itself. If New York transforms to a renewable energy infrastructure, it will protect our other vital industries that could be devastated by shale gas development. Again, these industries include tourism, agriculture, organic farming, hunting, fishing, outdoor recreation, and wine and beer making. These industries can happily coexist, and they can grow and they can thrive right along with renewable energy development. And renewable energy development will not experience the same level of boom and bust that is typical of extractive industries. And dollars spent will stay in the state. New Yorkers will be earning the wages here, and the wind, water, and solar energy is produced in New York State with machinery and equipment that can be produced and maintained in New York. Again, unlike shale gas development, where most of the contractors and the equipment supplies come from other states such as Texas. Next slide, please. New York State's conversion to a wind, water, and solar energy infrastructure will reduce air pollution, reduce health costs associated with mortality and morbidity, protect other important industries, improve national security, set an example for other states to work toward reducing the cost of global warming, and it will create many jobs. The wind, water, and sunlight plan show that when externality costs are included, wind, water, and solar technologies cost less than conventional technologies. The cost due to air pollution, mortality and morbidity, lost productivity, and such in New York State is estimated to be about $33 billion per year, and that doesn't include the cost of global warming and climate change. Such costs are never reflected in business or investment decisions about fossil fuels. At both the state and federal levels, we need the political will to make changes that will incentivize private investment in renewables. We need to find more ways to offer low-cost and low-risk financing for renewable projects and energy efficiency programs. And we must immediately stop adding expensive infrastructure to accommodate fossil fuels. A new pipeline or natural gas power plant has a lifespan of around 30 to 50 years. So high amounts of renewable energy in the future require less fossil fuel infrastructure construction immediately. We must not allow the natural gas power plant proposed in Orange County. We must not allow the new gas pipelines that are proposed in New York. And we must not allow the gas storage facility in the Finger Lakes. We also must not allow the compressor stations that are being proposed in several places. Now, in my last few minutes, I hope I have a few more, I'll talk about some of the policies that have been used in various ways around the world to encourage investment in renewables. Next slide, please. Thanks. Feed-in tariffs, also referred to as FITs. They offer producers of electricity from renewable sources subsidized rates for power sold to the grid. They are used widely in Germany, Denmark, and Spain with great success. The European Environment Agency defines it as the price per unit of electricity that a utility or supplier has to pay for renewable electricity from private generators. The government typically regulates the tariff rate, the rate of the tariff. A few states and municipalities in the U.S. have them now. For example, Gainesville, Florida introduced one that pays, I think, something like 32 cents per kilowatt hour to Gainesville residents who have PV panels on their roofs. And that compares approximately to the 12 to 15 cents that Floridians typically pay per kilowatt hour for electricity. There are reverse auction mechanisms whereby governments invite competitive bids for contracts over the supply of electricity from renewables to the grid. They're bidding on supplying a specific amount of electricity from a specific renewable technology for a specific period of time. The successful bidder is awarded a long-term power purchase contract at its winning bid. The difference is paid for by distributing it across all ratepayers typically. And then there are tax incentives that reward investment in renewable power. They're sometimes in the form of investment tax credits, typically used for solar due to the high upfront capital costs. There are production tax credits that are typically used for wind. And it should be noted in the U.S., we do have a production tax credit for wind, and it's just been renewed, thank goodness. But it tends to be approved for 2 years, and then it goes away and comes back later. What we need is a long-term commitment to these things so that manufacturers will be encouraged to set up shop in the U.S. and in New York. We have to be able to count on a longer-term window of these credits. Investor confidence is improved if there is certainty in public policy. Investors are reluctant to commit funds to renewable energy projects if there's an expectation that a policy will be modified, eliminated, or replaced by a less favorable policy. This has hampered wind energy a lot in the U.S., and consistent, committed public policy has in large part caused the success of Germany's renewable energy transformation. There are renewable portfolio standards. They're sometimes set nationally, and in the U.S., they've been set at the state level typically. And these RPS standards require a given increase in the share of renewables in the jurisdiction's total energy mix by a certain date. And there are monetary grants and guaranteed loan programs and even so-called green banks developing. I think, to my knowledge, there's only one green bank so far in the United States, and that's in Connecticut. Governor Cuomo has recently announced that he plans to start one. And the idea here is to create public-private financing arrangements so that the risk to private investors is reduced. The goal is to provide low-cost, low-risk financing for renewable projects and energy efficiency programs. There are a number of policy tools that may be more effective at the national level than at the state level. For a while, the U.S. government provided clean renewable energy bonds, or CREBs, and subsidies are often discussed. Federal and state subsidies for fossil fuels, in my opinion, should be eliminated. There are widely varying estimates of the amounts of these subsidies. The IEA recently estimated that global fossil fuel subsidies are on the order of $520 billion. That's $520 billion for the fossil fuel industry, compared to global subsidies to renewables at only $90 billion. And I think the ratio is actually similar in the United States. The IMF recently issued a report that recommends eliminating fossil fuel subsidies worldwide. They state that such subsidies have adverse effects on public finances, economic growth, equity, and the environment. And of course, being a good economist, or maybe not so good economist, but I feel we should definitely have a tax on carbon. It would reduce emissions and raise revenue. And the increased revenue could be used for many needed things, including helping to offset any of the distributional issues that people are concerned with the imposition of a carbon tax. Even at the state level, a carbon tax could be imposed, and if we were to impose a carbon tax in New York State soon, it could set a good example for other states, and it could be a model for the federal government. A carbon tax may be the most important policy to level the playing field between fossil fuels and renewables. Fossil fuels now pay zero for their input of clean air, and they pay nothing for their output of CO2 or methane. Now, I've omitted some policy categories, but the bottom line is that there is already a range of possibilities. And it's really important that we begin to get innovative with financing. We have some great financial minds right here in New York State. In fact, some of them may be in this room tonight. So please start thinking about this right away. And New York State has made some progress already. New York has a renewable portfolio standard, 30% renewable by 2015. It should be increased and extended. As of now, I believe 29 states plus the District of Columbia have an RPS. And New York State is one of the more aggressive ones. I believe at this point, I think the only feed-in tariff in New York State is now in Long Island. They call it the Clean Solar Initiative. It's a 20-year commitment starting at 22 cents per kilowatt hour. New York State should definitely implement more FITs. New York State has just extended the New York Sun Initiative for another 10 years to 2023. That's very good. And we're actually seeing a return of manufacturing due to solar in New York State. Not due to shale gas, but due to solar. We have solar module manufacturing plants nearby here in Dutchess County and in Ulster County. And there was just an interesting piece in the Journal News the other day about a manufacturing plant in the Bronx. It has been there for 100 years and it produces elevator parts. They've installed a solar system and they've been saving at least $50,000 each year on their electric bills since then. Renewable energy prices will decline, helping both businesses and individuals. Be aware that shale gas prices will not stay low, especially if the gas industry is allowed to export our shale gas. There are efforts to convert liquid natural gas importing terminals to export terminals. Exportation would increase our currently low-priced natural gas when it's exposed to the global market where the price is 3 or 4 times higher. The Wind, Water, and Solar Plan has a section at the end of the report that lists many recommended first steps to incorporate the New York State Plan. A number of the action steps that I just described are included in those, and there are a number of others as well. We need a diversified portfolio of renewable energy technologies as described in the Wind, Water, and Sunlight Plan, and we also need a diversified portfolio of policies and incentives to get there. We need to put pressure on our leaders to move toward a renewable energy infrastructure and to protect New York State from the damage that would come with shale gas development and the potential damage from a nuclear accident. Next slide, please. My final slide I think it sums up quite nicely what we have to do. It was prepared for an upcoming event that is going to happen in Albany on June 17th. It's called New York Crossroads, Rally and March to Stop Fracking and Say Yes to Renewable Energy. Please join this rally and say no to fracking and say yes to renewable energy in New York. Thank you.
Energy, and he is here via Skype, which I think is a zero carbon means of being with us today. So join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Jacobson.
Thank you so much. I just want to check whether you can hear me. Can I get a confirmation? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. So I want to follow up on the previous talks and discuss kind of in detail the plan for powering New York State with wind, water, and sunlight for all purposes. And I want to first go through the motivation and a little bit, even though you are all motivated, I probably don't have to convince you, but I still want to just go through this briefly. Why do we want to act quickly? From our point of view, it's air pollution on a worldwide scale, kills 2.5 to 3 million people each year from respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease, complications from asthma. In New York State, it's about 4,000 people every year. This is just the deaths, and there's illnesses as well. Arctic sea ice may disappear in 10 to 20 years. Global temperatures today are rising at a faster rate than any time in history. It's the rate of change of temperature today that's unique. Even though temperatures 100 million years ago were higher than today, nobody lived back then. Today we have 7 billion people, and if we melt all the ice in the world, then the 7% of all the coastlines worldwide would be flooded. And increasing energy demand today is increasing pollution, global warming, and energy prices. And if we go forward with the conventional fossil fuels, we'll have higher energy prices in the future, and this will lead to economic, social, and political instability. So we think these are drastic problems that require immediate and definite solutions. Just to give some examples of air pollution, I mean, we look outside today or in the US, in most places, it doesn't look so bad, even though there are small particles and gases in the air that are causing mortality. But most of the world looks like this, in industrialized nations, newly industrialized nations, or even those that want to be industrialized. Sukhinda, India here. Here's Linfen, China. It's like smoking 3 packs a day, of cigarettes a day, living in this city. Just in January of 2013, this is what Beijing, China looked like for about a week and a half. On the bottom left is a photograph, a daytime photograph of the pollution there. And in New York City, this is kind of a map of the particle levels, pollution particles. It shows the dark parts of the city are up to 18 micrograms of particles per meter cubed of air. And just to put that in perspective, anything above 7 increases mortality significantly. And so there's significant pollution. As I mentioned, 4,000 people per year die in New York State from air pollution due primarily to fossil fuels and biofuels as well. Just to, again, to put in perspective, from the 1970s, this was the lungs of a non-smoking teenager who died in a car accident. And most people in big cities of the world, their lungs look like this. And people in the US, the average lifetime is about 6 to 9 months lower if you live in a big city than if you don't live in the city, just because of the air pollution. And just here's an example of one air pollution victim in San Jose, California, who died of asthma, who was 23 years old. So these are real people who perish due to the fossil fuel industry. Over the last 100 years, over 100 million people have died from air pollution due to fossil fuels. Global temperatures, as I said, are rising quickly, and of the warmest years in the most recent historic record, that's in the last 150 years, 9 out of the 10 most warmest have been in the 2000s. And temperatures, as I said, are rising fast. So, and one more effect that I want to just mention, Hurricane Sandy was, Superstorm Sandy, its intensity was increased due to higher sea surface temperatures offshore of the East Coast, and the higher sea levels that have already occurred off in the oceans contributed to greater storm surge. So this is a serious problem, the greater intensity and frequency of severe storms. And the solutions that we're going to talk about today, one of the solutions could actually ameliorate this impact quite immediately. And so we'll talk about that also. So what is the solution? What are the solutions that we're looking at? Well, we've done studies over the years looking at what are the best technologies in terms of their impacts on the environment, and also in terms of allowing reliability and also having available resources. And this particular table shows the recommended technologies for electric power and transportation. And so the recommended ones are for electric power are wind power, concentrated solar power, geothermal, tidal power, photovoltaics, wave power, and hydroelectricity. And they're for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into the details, but the bottom line is they reduce air pollution and the climate impacts the greatest, and while providing reliable energy. For vehicles, well, by the way, so these are all derived from wind, water, and sunlight, so we call them WWS, or wind, water, and sun technologies. And for vehicles, these electric power sources powering either battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are the recommended options. What we don't recommend, and it's not because some of these might be better than what we have today, it's just that they're not so good as what's recommended. I mean, some of these on this list are a little bit worse than what we have today on average, but some of them are better than what we have today, but they're still much worse than or moderately to much worse than what is recommended. So, and I'll explain a little bit more detail in subsequent slides. So what's not recommended are nuclear power, coal with carbon capture, natural gas, or biomass. We will allow a small amount of solid biomass these are for electricity for a few years, but we've also phased that out. And for vehicles, we don't recommend either corn or cellulosic or sugarcane ethanol, soy or algae biodiesel, or compressed natural gas. So I'll try to explain in more detail why not some of these. So why not natural gas? Well, in terms of carbon, it's about 50 to 70 times more CO2 equivalent emissions and air pollution per kilowatt hour generated than wind power. So we don't think, first of all, we even need to compare with coal, natural gas with coal. It's really a comparison with the best technologies. And when you compare natural gas with the best technologies, you find that it's much worse, 50 to 70 times more pollution and carbon than wind, for example. The methane and also black carbon, which is from natural gas flaring, by the way. Methane and black carbon from natural gas are two of the main contributors to Arctic sea ice loss. They both have very high global warming potentials over a short period, and both, even over the long period, have significant impacts. But in comparison with coal, natural gas causes more global warming, but less air pollution than coal over even a 150-year time frame. And there are really three components of both that are important for looking at this issue. One is sulfate aerosols, the second is methane, and the third is carbon dioxide. So natural gas emits less carbon dioxide, but much more methane and less sulfate. But the sulfate from coal, ironically, even though it causes a huge amount of air pollution mortality, actually offsets a lot of the warming from coal, even when you account for just methane and CO2 from natural gas versus coal, depending on the time frame you look at, you get different people will get different results. But you can show that even with just methane and CO2, you can show that natural gas causes more warming, particularly over 20 years. However, when you also account for the sulfate from coal, you find that the natural gas causes much more warming than coal, but the coal causes much more air pollution mortality. So they're both bad, and we need to get rid of and eliminate both coal and natural gas in favor of wind, water, and solar technologies, which do not have either of these problems of warming or mortality. And of course, as has been expounded in the previous talks, hydrofracking causes a lot more problems in addition to conventional natural gas. Well, why not what's called clean coal or coal with carbon capture? Well, in the case of coal with carbon capture, what they do is they take the CO2 out of the stack and pump it underground. And that reduces a lot of the stack emissions by 85 to 90%. However, you need 25% more energy, and therefore 25% more coal to run the carbon capture equipment. And you don't eliminate any of the mining or transport of the coal emissions. In fact, those increase 25%. And you do not eliminate any of the other air pollutants aside from carbon dioxide. So all the other pollutants go up by 25%. So it should not be called clean coal, it's really dirty coal. But the problem is, it doesn't actually even exist at the commercial scale. So it's a big waste of research dollars, while we need to solve these problems today with existing technologies. Why not nuclear power? It causes about 9 to 25 times more pollution per kilowatt hour than wind energy. Half of that's from the mining and refining of uranium, plus using fossil fuels for electricity, plus the development of the plants themselves. And the other half is what's called the opportunity cost loss. And that's because it takes so long, between actually 10 to 19 years, to plan, permit, and construct a nuclear power plant, compared with 2 to 5 years for a wind or solar farm. So in the meantime, while you're waiting for your nuclear plant to go up, you're running the regular electric power grid, and so you have a lot of emissions associated with that. Now, there's also other risks of nuclear, including the risk of meltdown. 1.5% of all nuclear reactors ever built to date have melted down, and there are over 440 reactors have been built, and 1.5% have melted down to some degree. 5 countries of the world have also developed nuclear weapons capability secretly under the guise of civilian nuclear energy programs. And also there are unresolved waste issues. Well, one of the issues, let's look just at another fuel, which is ethanol for transportation. We've proposed using electric vehicles primarily with some hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. But if we look at ethanol, there's a huge push in the US for use of ethanol since it would help farmers. But just to give you an idea, if we wanted to repower the entire transportation infrastructure of the United States, let's look at how much land area would be needed for different technologies. So we'll look at ethanol-fueled vehicles versus electric vehicles powered by wind, water, and sun, primarily, and we'll also look at one case of nuclear powering electricity. So if we use cellulosic ethanol to power the whole US vehicle fleet, we would need this much land area, which is equivalent, though there's a range of 5 to 35% of the entire US, including Alaska, and this represents about 20%. And by the way, cellulosic ethanol, even though it's been talked about and a lot of money has been put into it, there's not a single commercial cellulosic ethanol factory in the world. So it's actually a technology that doesn't exist, although it's been proposed since 1981, and lots of money's been put into it. So again, we need to use existing technologies, and if we look at cellulosic, it takes up so much land that it's really an intractable and infeasible solution. Corn ethanol, which is less efficient, actually takes slightly less land area on average than cellulosic, but still 14% of the entire US, including Alaska. Now, nuclear energy powering battery electric vehicles, it would not take up a huge amount of area, about the size of Rhode Island. So we can sacrifice Rhode Island if we want to go the nuclear route. So that's not one of its main issues. Now, wind power powering battery electric vehicles, the spacing area, there's a black circle and a red dot in the middle. The black circle represents the spacing area needed, but that area is all can be used for multiple purposes, such as rangeland, farmland, cropland, pastureland, open space. And the red dot in the middle is the footprint, which is the land on the ground actually taken up. And it would only require less than 3 square kilometers of land to power the entire US vehicle fleet, which with these turbines, and these turbines you would need about 73,000 to 144,000 5-megawatt wind turbines to power the whole US vehicle fleet. And so these could be either on land or a lot could go offshore. And so it doesn't even have to take up land too very much. And then finally, solar and geothermal, they take up even less spacing area than wind, but more footprint. Again, these are to power the entire US vehicle fleet. So in terms of land areas, we'll see from other figures I'm going to show you shortly, it's not a big, it doesn't take up a lot of area to power huge sectors of the energy economy in the US or in New York State. I'll show some more details later. So let me just briefly go over visually what are the technologies we're talking about. We're interested in wind turbines. So on the left panel here are some example wind turbines, wave devices, which take advantage of the up and down motion of the waves, converting mechanical energy into electricity, which is transmitted underwater to shore through a cable. There's hydroelectric power on the top left, which could be either in dams or run-of-the-river hydro. And we don't propose new dams for the most part. It's existing dams and existing hydroelectric plants. In some cases, it might be converting some existing dams for hydroelectricity, but it's better management of existing dams. We don't anticipate growth, but there is some advantage from a storage point of view of having some hydroelectric power. Then tidal power, tidal turbines on the top right here are similar to wind turbines, but they're under the water. And then geothermal power is really taking advantage of hot rocks under the ground. and converting that heat energy into electricity by heating water and generating steam. And then there's solar power. On the top left, we have what's called concentrated solar, where light is focused off of mirrors to a central tower receiver to heat a fluid. And that fluid can then be stored at night or used during the day to heat water. And the steam from the water then drives a turbine to generate electricity. So a nice thing about concentrated solar power Can you see the slide? Yeah. Okay. So the top left is a concentrated solar power plant. And the nice thing about concentrated solar,
It went back.
forward one more.
Previous slide.
Okay, that's interesting because I'm actually on the next slide. So.
Now you are.
Yeah.
Next
All
slide.
right.
Now you go back.
Okay, yeah, we're on the same. I want to go back to the solar slide. So I'm going to go back one. Okay, it should come back. Okay, it's not. Okay, well, I'll skip that. So I'm going to go forward back to this slide. Okay, well, I'll leave it there for a second. So the nice thing about concentrated solar power is that you can use it to generate electricity at night as well as during the day. Now, the other solar that I showed on the previous slide was photovoltaics, which can either be in power plants or it can be on rooftops, and that's very common. So on this slide, I'm showing transportation options. Primarily, we'd be relying on electric vehicles, battery electrics. And so here are three examples: the Tesla Roadster, which is a two-seat car that can go 240 miles on a charge. The Nissan Leaf, which is only about 80 miles on a charge, but it's a commodity car. And then the Tesla Model S, which can go 310 miles on a charge and can be charged now in 1 hour with a 440-volt charger. And the Tesla Model S can seat up to 7 people with two of the seats or jump seats in the back. Now on the bottom we have examples of existing technologies: an electric bus, an electric truck, and a hydrogen fuel cell electric hybrid bus. So these are existing technologies. On the next slide, which is coming up in a second for you, I'm showing an example of a hydrogen fuel cell ship. There we go. And a fuel cell tractor. These are existing technologies. An electric ferry. And on the bottom right is a cryogenic hydrogen aircraft. Now, this is one technology that doesn't exist at a commercial scale. This is just a drawing. And cryogenic hydrogen is really liquefied hydrogen at low temperature. And it was used in the space shuttle to propel the space shuttle to space. And the Russians built a cryogenic hydrogen aircraft in the late 1980s. But with cryogenic hydrogen, you'd have a bigger fuselage because you need hydrogen, which is not very dense, so it takes up a lot of space. But it would be less massive, less weight. So the total drag on the plane would be similar, and studies so far have indicated that it would be about the same total drag and therefore the same efficiency of the aircraft. But it will still take a while for that to be converted. Now, for homes, for heating and cooling, there's several options that are existing. One is on the top left, or on the left, are air source heat pumps, which really extract heat from the air, and then you just run electricity. So you use electricity to extract heat from the air, and then it's pumped into your house. And there's also, for very, very cold temperatures, you can add an electric resistance heating element to that. And the heat pumps can either be air source, extracting heat from the air, or ground source, where you extract the heat from the ground, or water source, where you take it from the water. And these can be run in reversed for air conditioning. They're much more efficient. They're very efficient, even in comparison to electric resistance heating. And they're used quite a bit. Now, they can also be used on water heaters to heat water, such as in the middle case. And then you can also have a solar hot water preheater on your roof to preheat water for your water heater so that you use less electricity in your heat pump water heater. Now, there's another technology that's kind of interesting, which is called seasonal heat storage. And this is an example. There's a community in Alberta, Canada called Drake Landing. And what they have is several houses that have solar collectors on the roof. So during the summer, they heat a fluid that goes to a little substation near the houses and heats water that is then pumped underground, filtered underground, and that then heats the soil. So the soil gets heated, and that hot soil is stored until winter time, and the whole process is run in reverse in the winter to provide heating for water and air. And this provides about 85 to 90% of all the heat for this community, and it's been around for about 5 years. So this is called seasonal heat storage. Now, let's then look at, let's look at powering New York State. So we did an analysis, well, if we previously did analysis for the world and then the US and also now for New York State, where we want to see how much energy do we need to power these entities, these groups. Now for the world, for example, the world power demand in 2010, that's the end use power demand, was 12.5 terawatts or trillion watts. And that number might not mean anything, but just these are all relative numbers. I just want to put it in perspective. If we go to 2030 with current fuels, we'll be up to 17 terawatts. Worldwide, if we convert everything to WWS and electricity and some hydrogen, we actually reduce our power demand at the world scale by 32%. And that's because electricity is so much more efficient than combustion. For example, in an electric vehicle, 80 to 86% of the electricity going in the car goes to move the car, and the rest is waste heat. But in a gasoline car, only 17 to 20% of the energy in the gasoline goes to moving the car, and the rest is waste heat. So you have a 4 to 5 times greater efficiency of an electric car versus an internal combustion car. So as a result, the cost of driving an electric car, the fuel cost, is about 80 cents a gallon equivalent versus $4 a gallon for the gasoline car. So if you have an electric car for 15 years, which is the average lifetime of a car, and you drive the average US mileage of 15,000 miles per year, over the 15-year period, you would save $20,000 on fuel costs compared to your gasoline car. And if the price of gasoline goes to $8 a gallon and electricity, the price of driving your electric car goes up equivalently to $1.60 a gallon, then you'd save $40,000. So your electric car would have to cost either $20,000 or $40,000 more than the gasoline car for it not to be worth getting an electric car, just from a cost point of view. Now, if we look at the energy balance in the whole US, if we do this conversion to wind, water, and solar, we reduce power demand by 37%. That's because you get a lot of benefits from transportation, and the US has significant transportation needs, and as a result, you get a higher reduction than on the world scale. In New York State, we also get about a 37% reduction in energy use. By the way, so this is not the reduction in energy due to energy efficiency measures, although this actually does account for about 5% of this reduction is energy efficiency. But we could get, in addition to this, up to another 20% or even 25% reduction in energy use from efficiency measures, such as retrofitting homes, using better light bulbs, etc., and changing our habits. But that's not accounted for here because we're trying to be conservative to see whether we can repower these regions, the state, the US, the world, assuming that people don't change their habits. And so, but anyway, these reductions are primarily, as I said, just due to the efficiency of electricity versus internal combustion. So for New York State, here is kind of the set of resources that we would use, or technologies that we would use to provide that end-use power in 2030 if we converted everything to wind, water, and solar. This is for all purposes, by the way. We're converting electricity, transportation, heating and cooling, and industrial processes. So we're eliminating all fossil and fuel and nuclear use and biofuel use, in fact, except for some temporary use of solid biomass. So in this case, we would supply our energy for all purposes with 10% onshore wind, 40% offshore wind, 6% from residential rooftop photovoltaic systems, 12% from commercial government rooftop systems, 10% from solar PV power plants, 10% from concentrated solar power plants, 5% from geothermal plants, 5.5% from hydroelectric plants, and 1.5% from a combination of tidal and wave devices. And so I'll show you how much area this all takes up next. So this slide shows which is coming up, this slide shows the footprint and spacing area to repower the state of New York for all purposes. The blue is for wind, both onshore and offshore. And so keep in mind that that blue area is all open space that can be used for multiple purposes, except for the red dot in the center, which that red dot is the footprint on the ground. So the spacing area on land is about 1.5% of the state's land area. But again, that can be used for farming or open space or grazing land or ranch land. The solar power, the red on the bottom would be on rooftops, so that would not take up new land. But the red in the middle, that would be about 0.85% of New York State. And then the geothermal is a very small area. It's about 0.01% of the state. So the land area needed for this whole thing is on the order, the actual physical land on the ground is about 0.85% or 0.86% of the state, less than 1%. The land plus state, the actual physical land plus the spacing area is on the order of 2.25% of the state. Now, we did the same thing for California to look at what's the areas to repower the state of California for all purposes. And that's shown on the next slide, which is here. And in this case, again, the blue is offshore wind. The green is some onshore wind. And the big red dot is solar PV plus concentrated solar. The yellow is rooftop solar, and then there's a little bit of geothermal. So again, these areas are not large to repower the state. This does not account for the fact that we would be eliminating all pipelines, all refineries, all gas stations, all mining, natural gas mining, coal mining, uranium mining, all nuclear plants, all infrastructure related to the conventional fossil fuels would be, well, most of it would be eliminated. You'd still probably have some infrastructure because you would probably still have plastics, for example, from fossil fuels where you don't use the fossil fuels for combustion, but you have maybe chemical processes. Now, the next slide is kind of showing, well, we want to see, do we have enough resources in New York to power solar and wind in particular, since those solar and wind will make up 90% of the energy that we need for all purposes. This is a kind of a solar map of the US. And what it indicates is in New York State, the solar resources are particularly are the best on the eastern side of the state, southeastern side of the state. They are about 25 to 30% lower than, let's say, in California, but it's still 25 to 30%. It's still good enough. It's still actually better than in Germany, where they have a huge amount of solar infrastructure, and so you can get a lot of power. And it's also, even though we didn't analyze out-of-state solar for this plan, it is conceivable that we could actually import some solar from, let's say, New Jersey and export more wind from New York to New Jersey or something like that. There's no reason you can't use, in fact, it's probably more efficient to have good interconnections between some states to use resources from other states as well. Now, but we did find that there's plenty of solar in New York State, and it's sufficient solar. But there's even more wind than solar. I mean, the wind resources are phenomenal. So that's what I'll show next, particularly offshore. So the onshore wind resources, we have many times more wind resources onshore than we propose for our plan. But offshore, the red, I mean, all the reds and the pinks and even the dark greens are really good resources. The only bad resources on this map are the blues, and only the blue is bad. Everything else has what's a capacity factor of 30% or higher, and that's really good. I mean, ideally you'd want 35% or higher, but 30% is still pretty good. And so pretty much all the areas that are shown here that are not blue are good resources, but particularly offshore, there's a huge resource, plenty to power the state of New York for all purposes, but we want to keep reasonable proportions between wind and solar as I'll explain shortly. Now, the other benefit of having offshore wind is dissipation of hurricanes and their impacts. So we did a study looking at what's the impact of putting up lots of wind turbines offshore of the East Coast, and we also did a study for New Orleans to see what would happen if we had had a huge offshore wind farms off New Orleans when Katrina hit. And this shows a result for New Orleans. There on the left is a simulation of Hurricane Katrina without any wind turbines, and on the right we have Hurricane Katrina with wind turbines in the sector where it's there's a blue triangle, which is just offshore and to the east, southeast of New Orleans itself. So we put up a huge number of turbines there. So as the hurricane comes in, the turbines start to dissipate, extract the energy, and start dissipating the hurricane. So I'm going to show a time series of slides, and from this you can see over time as the hurricane moves in that it gets dissipated more and faster when you have the turbines present on the right side compared with on the left side. And the end result of this is that we've concluded in this case that having huge numbers of offshore wind turbines, it would not only generate electricity year round, even if no hurricanes come around, it's still beneficial. But when a hurricane does come around, then you can reduce the storm surge in the case of Katrina by up to 70% or slightly more, and reduce the wind damage as well. And so in fact, there's this multiple benefit of these offshore wind turbines, whereas if you built seawalls, which is the alternative being proposed, they might reduce the storm surge or the damage from the storm surge. They don't actually reduce the storm surge, just the damage from the storm surge, but they don't generate electricity. So they only have one purpose: to block the water in case a hurricane comes, whereas these turbines can not only do that, reduce the storm surge, but also generate electricity year around. So it would seem like a better type of investment. So just a couple more points before I wrap up. What about reliability? People always ask, well, wind and solar in particular are intermittent. So the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. So can you generate electricity reliably with this 100% wind, water, and solar system? So this shows results from a study we did for California, looking at is it possible to repower the whole state of California, the electric power part of it, with wind, water, solar, and matching the power demand. So we looked at 2 years, every day for 2 years, and this shows results for 2 days during that period, where the black line in each figure is the electricity demand on those days, and this is for 2005 and 2006. Then we were trying to match the demand with renewable supply. We used data to get the wind resources and solar resources at different locations in the state. So the bottom line is the geothermal. The red on the bottom is geothermal, and the light blue is wind. So the wind is mostly peaking in the evening and early morning. The yellow is solar photovoltaics. The orange is concentrated solar, and the dark blue is hydroelectric, which is used to fill in the gaps. And so we were able to match on these 2 particular days the power demand exactly with the supply without any natural gas backup. And the gray on top is the backup, which is, for this study, was assumed to be natural gas. And it turned out that we only needed natural gas 0.2% of the hours over 2 years. So in other words, 99.8% of the hours over 2 years, we did not need any additional backup. And this study was done without even taking additional measures, such as using what's called demand response, where utilities will pay companies not to generate electricity, or not to use electricity at certain times of the day, and then shift the times they use it to different times. And also, in our case, we're going to be using electricity not only for electric power, but also for transportation, heating and cooling, and industry. So we can oversize the wind generators, the solar generators, to produce more electricity than we need. And then when we have too much electricity, we can dump that into producing hydrogen or to heating cities through district heating, such as done in Denmark. And so it would make it easier to match the power demand. In other words, there are several ways to actually match the power demand with renewable supply reliably. There's no technical reason we can't do it. It's merely an optimization problem. What about costs? So we did a detailed analysis of the costs of energy today and in the future. And today, if we look on the bottom of this diagram, the cost of conventional fuels today are about almost 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And there's another 5 cents a kilowatt hour of what are called externality costs, or health and climate costs in particular. And this is, if we just look at the trends from the past and we project those to the future, by 2020 to 30, the cost should go up to 12 to 15 cents for the conventional fuels, plus another 6 cents for externalities. So from 18 basically to 21 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, right now, onshore wind, geothermal, and hydroelectric are cost competitive with conventional fuels. And offshore wind, wave power, and concentrated solar and solar PV are higher, although solar PV utility scale is really approaching conventional fuel costs. Now, if we go into the future, we expect all the wind, water, and solar technologies, the cost will come down, while the conventional fuels, their cost will go up. And that's because there's zero fuel cost for the wind, water, solar technologies. They usually have a higher capital cost, but they have zero fuel cost. So they will lead to price stability. And to illustrate this, let's look at briefly the cost of energy of electric power in the US between 2003 and 11. If we take the 5 states with the highest percent of electric power from wind, which were South Dakota, Iowa, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wyoming, between 2003 and 11, the cost of electricity in those states went up 2 cents a kilowatt hour. In all the 45 other states, they went up 3.6 cents a kilowatt hour. In other words, the states with the greatest increase in the percent of electricity from wind experienced the lowest electricity price increases. In fact, Hawaii, the cost of electricity went up 17 cents a kilowatt hour during this period. And that's because fossil fuels have to be mined, transported, and refined. So these costs all go up over time. Whereas wind and solar, the price of the fuel is zero. So all you're doing is paying the capital cost. So you have a more steady, and you know your costs into the future a lot better. Okay, so let me skip through this. This is subsidies, $72.5 billion of subsidies for the fossil fuel industries. Health cost savings from our plan is 4,000 people die per year. Right now, we would eliminate that. We'd save $33 billion per year in health and work costs that are associated with that, with those mortalities, or 3% of the state's gross domestic product. And then I'll skip that. The job creation, we find we get a net of 35,000 additional permanent jobs per year because almost all the jobs will be in the state, all the fuel will be generated in the state compared with currently the fuel is generated out of the state for the most part. And this just shows kind of how the transition between today and 2050, we expect by 2030, 80% of our energy will be clean energy and 100% by 2050. And so we get the reductions from conversion to electricity, some end-use efficiency, and then the rest is generated by wind, water, and solar. So finally, to summarize, if we convert to this wind, water, and solar plus electricity and hydrogen, we'd reduce New York State power demand 37%. We'd eliminate 4,000 air pollution deaths per year, or 3% of the state's GDP, eliminate global warming emissions from the state, provide energy and price stability because there's zero fuel cost. We generate a net of 35,000 additional jobs. We reduce the economic electricity costs compared with those of fossil fuels. We need only 1% of the state land for footprint and 1.5% additional for spacing. There are many methods of addressing variability. Materials are not limits. I didn't talk about this, but recycling may be needed. There are some barriers in terms of upfront cost, transmission lead, and of course, lobbying and politics. And just finally, if you want more information on this, here's a website and a couple websites, and if you want to follow the Solutions Project, which is really a project designed to address this problem, these problems in New York State and other states as well. If you want to help solve the problems, please join the Solutions Project at that website. So thank you all very much.
Dr. Jacobson, stay with us. Stay with us. I've just had the extraordinarily difficult task of sorting out questions from approximately 70 submitted by you all. And I sense that everyone in the audience is either an electrical engineer, an expert in econometrics, public policy. The questions are brilliant. So I'm going to try to ask questions that will take us perhaps a little past 9, but not past, say, 10 after 9. Feel free to go if you've got to go. But believe me, the question from fossil fuels, from this report, it seems as though technology is ready. Can you address why this gap exists? And can this plan work if other states are not also pursuing wind, water, and sunlight? How does this plan address economics of scale? And I throw it open.
Mark, you got the first one.
Okay. Well, I would say that there's actually a lot of growth. I mean, last year, 25% of all the electricity produced in Iowa was from wind power. 24% of all the electricity produced in South Dakota was from wind power. 21% from Iowa, and solar is growing. So there are states and countries. In fact, you can go to Europe and you could find some countries in the last year up to it's like 60%, maybe closer to 40% on average over the year, and 60% on some days was from wind and solar. I mean, wind and solar are wind and solar made up more than 50% of all the new electric power last year in the U.S. In March of 2013, solar was the only new source of electric power, and in January, wind and solar were the only new sources of electric power. So these are growing really rapidly. Electric cars are on the road today. There are many car companies producing them. We can see them, especially in California, where we have a lot of electric cars. I can see them daily on the street. So I think that's growing rapidly. So I don't think I think the facts on the road or facts on the ground are such that things are changing. Now we do need to ramp them up a lot, and this will not happen unless a lot of people are behind it. And so I do agree that we can't get to where we want to go unless we have politicians behind it and policymakers and the public. And so it won't just happen. We won't get that conversion just by watching these small changes each year. We need 100% new power from clean energy each year if we really want to make this transition.
A related question is, at some points in the study, the time frame of 2030 is referred to, and at other points in the study, the time frame of 2050 is referred to. Is this feasible by 2030? What's the temporal difference between 2030 and 2050 in the study?
Let me clarify. So 2030, we found that it would be technically feasible to make that conversion, but politically and socially, it probably won't happen. So our numbers were based on 2030 in terms of the number of generators. However, we also note that the population growth of New York State is so slow that between now and 2030, only about a 2% increase is projected by the U.S. Census Bureau, and so similarly for 2050. So those numbers should be the same pretty similar in terms of the generation required. But we really think from practical point of view, like that slide I just showed near the end, that we can do 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. If we can make, by 2020, if we can have all new generation and all new vehicles and all new technologies, wind, water, and solar, such that gradually over time, as you phase out the older stuff, you're always replacing that with new stuff.
Wonderful. The most questions were about politics, about Governor Cuomo, about President Obama. Here's a question. Who is leading the movement in Germany to solar power, the politicians or the people? A question closer to home. Have Governor Cuomo and his staff been exposed to the plan? How do we motivate elected officials here in New York? Who would like to take those questions?
You want to do Germany?
Okay. I'll just say a word about Germany, because I've been doing some studying up on Germany. But in Germany, they have everybody seems committed, the politicians and the people, and they actually are very excited about the whole thing. And I think that's what we need. We need both here as well. But that has caused a lot of the success in Germany, in addition to them being very consistent in the policies that they impose and make it clear to people that this is going to be a long-term commitment, so that the investors are willing to come in and put their capital in.
And of course, that's related to the second question. If in Germany everybody's all in, is Governor Cuomo all in? Well, we've been promised that we will get our moment in the governor's office. He certainly is aware of the plan. His staff has read the plan. And the governor has promised that he will meet with us at some time, and we're on the governor's, what's he called? The person who keeps his calendar? The calendar secretary, the governor's calendar secretary list of meetings to confirm with us. That's political speak for when he feels like it, he'll meet with us.
Well, that brings the next question perfectly into focus, because many people believe that we are not fracking in New York because of a massive wave of public opposition to the process. Can there be a massive wave of public support for wind, water, and sunlight?
We're counting on it.
Come to the rally. We hope so. Come to the rally on June 17th on the East Lawn.
We're counting on that.
Yeah.
And it starts with meetings like this. It starts with, the most important conversations happen in the kitchen of everybody's home. Think about it that way. Are you going to stop and switch in your own home? Stop using fossil fuels to the extent you can. Start switching to renewables to the extent you can. Happens in everybody's kitchen, happens in everybody's community. Ithaca, we're investing in our own wind farm in Ithaca. And there are passive homes being built in downtown Ithaca today. So if downtown Ithaca can do it, Germany can do it, we can do it anywhere in New York State.
How do we get people under 30 years old involved? Most people in this room are over 30. Really? This fracking energy issue is being put on our shoulders. Ageism is being practiced here. This fracking energy issue is being put on our shoulders with few of the youth being involved.
Do you want to, I can. Okay, so Dr. Barth and I were remarking when you all first sat in the room that we noticed that there's an unusually large percentage of young people in this crowd. We don't usually see this. I'm talking about. Nobody in the room is over 39, but there are a lot of people who appear to be younger than most, and that's a really good sign. I should point out that most campuses in states that have RPSs have Kyoto Now clubs, where the students have taken on their own the job of doing what our federal government has not done, which is to recognize that long ago we should have been doing something, and long ago as a country we should have committed to doing something, because after all, a lot of that carbon dioxide that's up there and a lot of that methane, it was put there years ago by us. By us, Americans. We are energy hogs. We are energy greedy. And we are largely responsible, and totally out of proportion to our population, for what we're doing to the world climate. And our youth understand that better than our non-youth in Washington. So there is a growing campaign across the country, you probably heard about this, some of you, for divestment. And that campaign is being led by our young folks in high schools and colleges and community colleges. And that's as it should be, because our generation, speaking of us 39-year-olds, we're the energy hogs, and we have given to our children and our grandchildren a negative inheritance. They have to dig out of the hole that we put them in.
Some technical questions. How has the technology for battery storage kept up with solar and wind?
Well, I'll try to answer that. Battery storage is, it's still pretty expensive, but there are a lot of companies now, even Tesla is trying to develop battery storage technologies to back up solar and wind. And so there are a lot of other companies as well doing this. So I think that, but in our analysis, when we did that study for California, we did not need any backup battery storage because we have so many other ways to try to match the power demand with supply. So that's really the last resort, is for battery storage. But having said that, if we do have battery storage, it does make it easier. So we should still work on that. And it is coming through better. There are some wind farms that actually do use a lot of battery storage right now. It's just that it's more expensive. So it's coming along, but we don't necessarily think we don't have to rely on that for this plan to move forward.
Companies installing solar panels in the U.S. often purchase the panels made in China. They are less expensive. What can be done to promote American and New York State manufacturing of solar panels?
Yeah, we might have to provide some subsidies for them, but as I said, we have two relatively new solar manufacturing plants in northern counties here, and I think that if we could encourage a situation like Germany again, where the people are committed, hopefully we can encourage the buy local thing even for solar panels.
Could we have fewer transmission lines and more very local energy generation? Told you
Yes.
these questions were good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great questions. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Our plan, we have a combination of distributed energy and power plant energy. The power plants themselves are usually more efficient because you can put up, especially with wind, you can put up tall turbines and capture faster winds higher up because they're usually slower near the surface. But the trade-off is that you do have transmission, whereas in solar you can either have rooftop solar or local solar or power plant solar where you have more transmission. So we think that you should do as much as possible on roofs, and the rest do it in power plants. Although, right now the cost of energy from a power plant, utility scale solar, is less than from rooftop solar, so there's an incentive from the cost point of view to go to the power plants. But as much as we can do on roofs to minimize transmission, the better. So, it's kind of something in flux, but we're totally not opposed. If everything was done on rooftops and that worked, that would be great.
For Dr. Barth, New York appears to be lagging behind California, New Jersey, and Massachusetts regarding the solar PV development. Do you feel that NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA's programs for solar and wind are adequate? What do you think NYSERDA should do to enable more wind and solar?
Well, I do actually believe that Governor Cuomo's recommendation to start a green bank is probably one of the most important things to do, because that would done properly, it could encourage a tremendous amount of public-private partnerships and arrangements in the financing of this, and that's exactly what we need. It's too big an expensive project for the government to do it on its own, and the private investors are not going to do it on their own unless we can lower the risk and lower the costs. So we need good partnerships between both, and I think the Green Bank would be a good start.
I want to add to that. Two things, one of which Mark alluded to, is updating the renewable portfolio standard for New York to be much more aggressive. I think Mark, 30% by 2020, is that right? 2015? 30% by 2015? And obviously, to be consistent with our report, it has to be 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And so that's one thing that can be done. Another thing is we have a lot of agencies and entities in New York State that are all working not necessarily in concert with each other with respect to energy development. So it would be a great idea for the Public Service Commission of New York State to stop demanding that coal-fired plants shift to natural gas. I'd like to say that loud enough to be heard in Albany. Yeah.
The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast is often cited as a means of moving us into investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency and in putting a quote-unquote price on carbon. Could you tell us how the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is doing in New York? How are the other states in the region handling it? And are there similar efforts in other parts of the country?
I'm ignorant on that one. I admit it. I don't know anything about that. So,
Mark?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
They call it RGGI here in New York. It's a regional greenhouse gas initiative that stretches from New England down to the Mid-Atlantic states. Do you know how it is working in terms of promoting money for renewable energy, in terms of putting a quote-unquote price on carbon? And are there other equivalents in other parts of the country, for example, the Pacific Northwest or Central States?
Yeah, I don't know what the impact of that is. I can't say. I mean, I think it's not going to have as big a, I mean, we're trying to get a transformation, a complete transformation, and a lot of the policies in place right now will only allow modest changes over even long periods of time. And so, price on carbon, well, sure, we need that to get things going, but, we really need, we need lots of policy measures. I mean, that's one policy measure. We need lots of policy measures to be put in place. In fact, in the paper, there's maybe 40 different policy measures, and the price on carbon, I think, is one of those. So I don't know, I can't really quantify what the impact of that would be. And so, and also specifically for the region, I can't even say from the regional point of view what it would be, but I would say that that would only be one of many policy measures that we need to really aggressively push this thing forward.
A lot of questions came in connection with, can New York State do it individually? Do we need the other states in our region to do the same thing at the same time for us to have a chance to get this right?
But it would actually be helpful. The more states that participate simultaneously, because we showed that we could do it with New York alone, but in fact, there's already an interconnected transmission system across states. There's an advantage of combining like solar from the south with wind from the north, for example, to kind of optimize the grid. So there are advantages, and even taking hydro from Canada even, there is an advantage of going across state and across country borders and making a kind of regional or larger scale system, especially with renewables, where you have intermittency, where the sun doesn't always shine in one place, but it usually does if you look average over a larger area, and same thing with wind. So definitely you want to have other states involved as well, but we found it's technically possible not to do it with other states.
And to try to end on an inspiring note, how can we mobilize for renewable energy on the grassroots level in our communities?
who's the sociologist on the team?
We're in overtime here, I realize.
Yeah. Well, obviously everything starts with education. People have to understand as we tried to communicate to you tonight, what the impact of continuing with fossil fuels and in New York State increasing fossil fuel production would be at all levels: environment, human health, climate, economic. That amount of that type of education began in New York State 4 or 5 years ago when we were faced with the opportunity. And again, I repeat, we were wise enough in New York State, miracle, to say not yet, not now, maybe, we'll still think about it, and we're still in that mode. So that part of the education is still underway. I've given hundreds of talks around New York State in the last 5 years, and like you, the audience has gone from practically knowing nothing about fossil fuels and their generation to being advanced graduate students. So you've been educated. The other part of the education is one that, thanks to Mark, we began 2 years ago when we started working on this paper, which is, if not shale gas, then what? And so you're learning as we've learned and as we're trying to educate other people around New York State what they need to know about renewables, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So everything starts, this groundswell, this movement has to start with education, person by person, in the kitchens, in the classrooms, in meetings like this. The intended outcome then is that since people are wizened and informed and educated, they make the appropriate decisions and they influence their legislature and their regulators to make the proper decisions, and some of those we talked about tonight.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. Tony and I both work with a lot of grassroots organizations across the state who are primarily fighting fracking. And I think they're now coming to realize that instead of saying no, no, no all the time, we should be saying yes to something. And so they're coming around now too to trying to be more active, more serious activists about renewable energy. That's why this rally is taking place. And I really think that's a good place to go, because the anti-fracking grassroots organizations, I think, has been pretty successful at helping to hold off fracking for at least so far in New York. I think that, that might be a good place to start if you all wanted to get involved with some of those organizations, including right here in Westchester. We have Westchester for Change, and we have the Sierra Club group representatives here. So they're really, organizations right here in Westchester as well, and I'm sure I've left out some important ones.
Again, to end on an up note, let me remind everybody in the room of something. In 2008, when the grassroots organizations really started picking up steam in New York, it was all about stop fracking. Nobody was talking about climate change. Nobody was talking about renewables. It was just stop fracking. Look at the dots we've connected. We have become much more sophisticated, much more widely ranging in our ideas. We have lateral vision. We see things as the system that it is. The issue of shale gas coming to New York State started people thinking about other things, other very important things, like climate change, and like how do you slow down the problem that we've created for ourselves with fossil fuels. So I think New York should be very proud. We're the world leaders. People come from all over the country. I mean, how many times, maybe not Mark, but I know we've been visited by people from many countries. They come to New York State and they ask the question, why? Why are you so different from Pennsylvania?
It's the God's honest truth. At Riverkeeper, we get contacts from Poland, from the Czech Republic, and they're all looking to catch the magic that we've managed to catch. And I do believe, as I'm going to end this in the next minute or so, that what we have is the same opportunity to create the positive atmosphere for the change we want to see, because the way fracking has been held at bay in New York is through a combination of fact and activism and local resolutions. You all probably are familiar with the recent Middle Appeals Court decisions in the Dryden and Middlefield cases, which certified that local municipalities can control their future when it comes to fracking. Local municipalities can control their future when it comes to the power they buy, to the building codes and standards that they maintain. Citizens like you all can get educated on the facts about how it is doable to put renewable energy and energy efficiency into effect, and you can achieve the same sort of change that has been achieved in New York on fracking and turn it towards the goals that our three brilliant panelists have told us about this evening. So thank you to Doctors Barth, Ingraffea, and Jacobson, and thank you all for the work that you're about to go do now. Thank you all.
I just want to wrap this up very quickly. I know it's a late hour. First of all, thank you to Mark Jacobson, Dr. Mark Jacobson. Please give him a hand. Thank you so much. Dr. Anthony Ingraffea, all the way from Cornell. Dr. Jannette from right here in Westchester County. And for moderator, Paul Galley from the People. This was an outstanding program, and I just want to make a couple of points. First, we need to change the culture here, and that's been happening already through a variety of different situations, circumstances, and actions by many groups and many individuals. I just want to mention to you there was an empty seat here this evening, and that seat was being saved for Governor Cuomo. He lives very close by. He's, I think, about 1.5 miles from this library here in Mount Kisco, and he was invited to join us this evening through a variety of mechanisms. And unfortunately, he didn't join us. So how are we, all of us in this room, going to get this plan and these three brilliant experts into the governor's office? Or how are we going to get the governor to invite these experts here back to Mount Kisco to sit down and talk business, to talk about this plan? This is common sense. This is logical. This makes sense economically. On every level, this makes sense. So just think about some of these questions and the answers. What will you do? What do our state leaders need to know? Our state legislators need to know? Our national leaders need to know? How will you communicate that? Mark so eloquently said, join the solution. Please, there are some really wonderful local opportunities to join the solution. I'd like to take this opportunity because there will be an upcoming forum very soon here in Westchester County, and I'd really love for the chair of the Herb Orengo, I hope he's still here, from the Northern Westchester Energy Action Consortium, and all the members who might be present from NWEAC, and likewise Nina Orville, please stand, and any members from SWEAC, Southern Westchester Energy Action Consortium. These are the people on the ground who are already doing the work that we've talked about here this evening. They are implementing the practical application on the ground. And we have an opportunity to join them, and we have an opportunity to support them, and we have an opportunity to be part of the solution. So we are not going home empty-handed. We all have programs that have information and key resources. You have access to all of these experts, and you have access to the people here, right here in this community, who are making change. And we need to do something about it. And there is an old phrase, if the people lead, the leaders will follow. And I urge you, strongly urge you, to take action, express yourself, use your voice, write letters, and get involved if you're not already involved. Yes, Nikki?
How will the video be available?
Charlie, do you want to comment?
We'll probably put it up on YouTube. We have a lot of editing to do because the room was dark on a lot of people's faces, so I'm not sure how we're going to It's more like a radio show at the moment.
Yeah.
You guys improvised at the end and started playing with the lights, so I guess within a week or so we should have it up on YouTube. Our YouTube is called The Environment TV. So we have we're trying to become National Geographic with volunteers. But you can look that up. It's all one word with no spaces in between. The Environment TV. We have about 35 videos up there right now. And then you guys can take it and do whatever you want with it. We'll give it to you.
Great.
Anybody who wants to edit and work with it can take it.
Great. Just Ann?
If we all call the governor tomorrow, we should tell him to go ahead and schedule that meeting as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Great. There's a great action step. Thank you.
This project, you tell him?
The Solutions
Project.
The Solutions Project. Yes. And if you don't know the governor's phone number, email address, Twitter, he does have a Twitter account. You can communicate with the governor any way you like, including a little note. Please do that. That's excellent. Thank you, Ann Jaffe Holmes, a member of the SWIAC group here in Southern Westchester. So please look out for future announcements about this upcoming forum. And thank you so much for coming out this evening. And please go home and do your homework assignments. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Opportunity to come to Mount Kisco tonight to talk to an obviously very educated, very passionate audience. They've already gone through the last 4 years of New York State self-education about why not shale gas in New York, and they're hungry for the next step, which is what are we going to do? And what we're going to do is eliminate all the potential problems that would come to New York State if New York State were to go to shale gas, and substitute the obvious, which is make New York State move quickly and be a national leader to get to that 100% renewable energy schema within our lifetimes, and certainly within our children's lifetimes. We owe it to the next generation to help them dig out of the hole that our generation has put them into, because we waited so long to do something about an obvious problem with energy production in the U.S. and the concomitant problems that we're causing with climate change and human health effects. So it's a great opportunity to come here. Wonderful audience, younger than most, definitely smarter than most. So the three of us came here tonight specifically to talk about the plan to repower New York State by no later than 2050, preferably before 2030, with a fossil fuel-free energy portfolio. But that plan was also written for a couple of people in particular, one of whom sits in the governor's mansion. And we know that he's aware of the plan. We hope that he has personally read the plan. We presume he's being briefed by his staff on the plan. And we're very optimistic that Governor Cuomo is going to continue what he has been doing for the last couple of years, which is to act very wisely. He keeps saying, I want to see the science. Well, we've shown him the science against shale in New York, and now we're showing him the science for renewables in New York. Not only the technical science, but the political science, the economic science, the social science, it's all there. Our plan is not just a bunch of engineers and scientists saying, here's the numbers. Half of that paper, half of that plan is a large set of recommended changes in policies, changes in political viewpoints, changes in the investment community's view of renewable energies. We laid out a very broad technical plan that also has very long political and economic legs. So we're very optimistic that the governor's going to see this as consistent where he says he wants to take New York State, and we believe him.
Thanks so much for coming.
Sure.
Wonderful to have
Thank you.
Okay, how optimistic are you that this plan will actually come in that time?
This is so important that I can't even admit of the possibility of defeat. This has got to happen, so I will throw myself against every rock necessary to make this happen. That is the best answer I can give
Do you
you.
think it will? It's going.
I do.
For our
It has
kids' sake.
to.
We've got kids and I've got kids.
That's right. Plus, at some point, politicians have got to understand the essential nature of fighting this challenge we have with the climate, and they will.
Yeah, well, what about the fact that when we had Sandy and Obama's election was right after that, and that was supposed to be...
Well, they're talking the talk, and they're struggling to walk the walk. Their rhetoric is out ahead of their action, but their action will catch up. If you can stop fracking, you can jumpstart sustainable energy and energy efficiency.
But they can't help but see it. It's going to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, you've worked hard enough your whole life to get here, so you have to live long enough to see it happen, right?
That's right. That's right.
Exactly. Is that right?
I think an important takeaway from this event is hoping that we can engage more business leaders and hopefully get some of the businesses signed on to an initiative from the New Yorkers Against Fracking and the New York State Sustainable Business Council, which is the Businesses Against Fracking New York, and encouraging business leaders to just come out and take a stand on this issue and come out in favor of renewable energy.
Yeah, I thought Jannette was saying about the factory in the South Bronx that manufactures elevator parts or something, and how they, since they've installed a solar system, are now saving upwards of $50,000 on their electric bill, which is really extraordinary. And I think if other businesses knew that by investing in renewable energy, even just a solar system on their own business, they can reap the savings.
I think it takes more stories like that to come out for other people to be encouraged to make the switches as well. And it really is important that, in that sense, the more stories you hear like that, the more likely people are going to act. And so it takes these business leaders to come out and make a stand and take action, and not only using their own examples to encourage and stimulate others, but also putting that pressure on legislators to make it easier for more businesses to convert.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the panelists did a great job of drawing the connections between all the different aspects of this issue. So I thought Dr. Jacobson's graphics were very telling about how small the surface area on the state actually would be if we had a renewable energy economy, and that would give us so much land to use for agriculture and tourism and all of these other very productive industries that we wouldn't have if we focused on something like fracking instead. That really, I think, ties into things like the local food community, the businesses that are related to agriculture in Westchester County, and the ability to just use our land in more productive ways, which would benefit the whole state economy. I think that was a really good takeaway point from tonight.
I think they also did a great job of contrasting the land use, whether it's devoted to shale gas development, or if it is devoted to whether it's onshore wind and solar panels and the geothermal, and like you said, just the amount of land that is needed, and the difference between whether a landscape is developed for WWS or if it is developed for natural gas drilling, and just the impact on the environment, the impact on the landscape, natural habitats, public health, all of those.
Well, and yeah, and it was amazing that Mark was talking about how even in areas that have wind farms, you can also have animals grazing and the land can still be used at the same time for agriculture, which was really interesting. And not to mention, rooftops already exist, so slapping some solar panels on them isn't going to be taking up more space or doing anything invasive or industrial. It's just working with what we got.
Right, more compatible with our traditional sustainable economic drivers.
It really seems like the plan that we talked about tonight is just a win for everybody involved if we can get this done. It's just we have to get down and do the work and make sure our legislators know that this is what the direction the state needs to go in.
We can do it! Let's do the work!
Well, encourage more young people to get involved as well.
Right.
To power driven by wind, water, and sunlight. But
Called the Environment TV.
Bigger than most, definitely smarter than most.
Let's look at how much land area would be needed for different technologies. So we'll look at ethanol fueled vehicles versus electric vehicles powered by wind, water.
To realize that instead of saying no, no, no all the time, we should be saying yes to something. And so they're coming around now too, to trying to be more active, more serious activists about renewable energy. That's why this rally is taking place.
Encourage more young people to get involved as well.
Right.
Again, to end on an up note, let me remind everybody in the room of something. In 2008, when the grassroots organizations really started picking up steam in New York, it was all about stop fracking. Nobody was talking about climate change. Nobody was talking about renewables. It was just stop fracking. Look at the dots we've connected.
Let's do the work.